Hello everybody, welcome to all the human beings out there. My name's Gregory and this is the first episode of my Bob Dylan podcast, A Headful of Ideas. Why is it called A Headful of Ideas? Well, if you're familiar with Bob Dylan's oeuvre, sorry I probably haven't pronounced that right. If you're familiar with Bob Dylan's work, you'll know that these are the first lines of the first verse of Bob Dylan's very famous 1965 song Maggie's Farm. And I've chosen this as a title because it seems to sum up Bob Dylan himself. The first lines run, "I woke up this morning, hold my hands and pray for rain, got a head full of ideas that are driving me insane." Which to me is one of the most wonderful descriptions of poetic inspiration I've ever heard. It's also very funny. I was thinking of calling the podcast Random Bob, because that's what it is. I'm going to be picking up on random topics about Bob Dylan, and sometimes these will be talks, and sometimes they'll be a little more like lectures. And I'd very much like to involve you, the audience, in this, but more details of that later. The first season of the podcast will consist of 13 programmes. In some of these I'll be reading some extracts from the book, but in others I'll be picking up on various Bob Dylan songs from throughout his career. Firstly, here's a few words about me. I'm a writer and a poet, and I have a website called From the Pen of Gregory. I've had several books published which you can buy on the site if you want to. My most recent book is called Determined to Stand, the Reinvention of Bob Dylan, which is a study of Dylan's late work, going right up to the present with rough and rowdy ways. But again, more of that later. I want to begin by concentrating on the song that's inspired this title, Maggie's Farm. This is a song that has considerable historical importance in the development of Dylan's career, and also, arguably, in the development of 20th century music. It was one of the first songs that Dylan recorded with an electric band on the album Bringing It All Back Home in 1965. And perhaps more notoriously, it was part of the 3-song set that Dylan played at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. This is the famous occasion when the audience supposedly started booing Bob Dylan, which is a trend that went on for the next year and a half throughout his tours. And the opposition to Dylan came from folk purists, people who believe that proper folk music, intelligent music, could only be conveyed with an acoustic guitar, and that the use of electric instruments was bowing to commercialism. This is despite the fact that even at the Newport Festival 65 itself, there were several other bands playing electric music, but they tended to be in the fields of blues and country music. Somehow this was acceptable, but not to the folk purists. To them, Dylan was a kind of prophet. He was their leader, if you like. He'd written a number of very, very powerful protest songs making directly political statements, especially about war and about racism. They wanted to hear every word, rather like they were listening to a poetry recital. But when Dylan plugged in with this loud, noisy electric band, they couldn't always hear the words. There's a famous apocryphal story that Pete Seeger, who's the kind of godfather of American folk music, and he was present in a kind of supervisory role at the festival as well as performing. And the legend runs that dear old Pete had threatened to cut the cables that were making this electric performance possible. Later on, he defended himself from this accusation by saying what he was really upset about was that he couldn't hear the words. And he probably couldn't, given the state of amplification technology in 1965. Just over a year before this, the Beatles had landed in America and had completely changed the contemporary rock scene in that country. A lot of the other folk singers from the Greenwich Village scene, which Dylan emanated from, considered them to be mere purveyors of teeny pop But Dylan thought otherwise. His first love had been rock and roll. His first ever band back in the 1950s as a schoolboy had been a rock and roll band producing basically imitations of Little Richard, where Bob would jump up and down and scream a lot and try to play the piano. And he recognised the significance of the Beatles' success in taking America back to those rock and roll roots. Also gave him an opportunity to change his musical style, something Dylan of course has done many, many times. The performance of Maggie's Farm at Newport in 1965 is absolutely electrifying. We have this amazing lead guitarist, Mike Bloomfield, who plays the kind of solos that probably nobody had ever really heard before in this kind of context. He's the lead guitarist of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, several members of which backed Dylan on this impromptu performance, which was, like a lot of Dylan shows, not very rehearsed. The performance was later released on the bootleg series Volume 7, No Direction Home soundtrack, and it is featured in that wonderful biographical picture of Dylan made by Martin Scorsese in 2005. So Maggie's Farm is certainly a song that stirs people up. And it's still a song that stirs people up. It's intended to stir people up. It's not really a great work of poetry like Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall or Visions of Johanna. It's written in fairly simple, very colloquial language. But what it is a great demonstration of Dylan's ironic humour and how he could write something that could be interpreted in many different ways and used in many different situations. As well as being funny, it's also angry. And you can hear a very angry version of the song by Rage Against the Machine. All of this stuff is out there on YouTube if you know where to look, of course. And Dylan assumes a certain type of comic persona in the song. In his early years, his performances were often called Chaplin-esque. And you might say this is a kind of Chaplin-esque figure. He's downtrodden, he's made to slave on this farm, morning, noon and night, for almost nothing. And like Chaplin's tramp, the character that Dylan assumes here can be seen as a symbol of anybody who is oppressed by society. And like Chaplin, a lot of the time he plays it for laughs, but there's a serious message behind it. The song is full of American caricatures. Maggie herself is a character we're not actually told anything at all about. What we do hear about is her family, specifically her brother, her pa, and her ma. Her brother is a symbol of the bad American capitalist. He hands you a nickel, he hands you a dime, he asks you with a grin if you're having a good time. Not only oppressive, but slick. Perhaps that might remind you of a certain recently departed head of the American state. Maggie's pa is the nastiest of the three characters. We're told that he puts his cigar out in your face just for kicks, and that his bedroom window is made out of bricks. A ludicrous and rather surreal image of American bigotry. Maggie's ma is perhaps the most endearing of the three characters. She embodies official morality. She talks to all the servants about man and God and law. Everybody says she's the brains behind Pa. And what a wonderful bit of rhyming that is, of course. Finally, we're told that she's 58, but she says she's 64. In later versions, this is changed to 24. So perhaps we can have a little bit of sympathy for this character. We may imagine her as having paid lots of visits to the cosmetic surgeon, perhaps. Dylan's reaction to all of these characters is complete defiance. I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more, he tells us. And in the last verse, in very simple language, he outlines a kind of manifesto. Well, I try my best to be just like I am, but everybody wants you to be just like them. They say sing while you slave. I just get bored. This, of course, is a philosophy of individualism. Here the poet refuses to be taken in by the false pieties and hypocrisy of American society. There's a very pointed reference in the song when we hear that the National Guard stands behind Maggie's pa's door. Because the language of the song is so simple, it means that it can be interpreted in many, many ways. Really to any situation where authority is stifling freedom and creativity. So the song became a kind of anthem of the social youth revolution of the 1960s. But you can also sing it today to any stupid bureaucrat that tries to put you in your place. Okay? That's definitely allowed. There's also a strange sense of prescience about the song. In 1982, the Specials, the famous two-tone group, recorded a version of Maggie's Farm on one of their B-sides. They changed the reference to the National Guard to the National Front. The National Front were the leading fascist, racist organisation of the day. And the references to Maggie in the song seem to have been written deliberately to be directed at the British Prime Minister of the time, Margaret Thatcher, known to friends and foes alike as Maggie. To those of us in Britain at the time, it did indeed seem like we were actually living on Maggie's farm. Despite the simplicity, or relative simplicity, or apparent simplicity of the language, Maggie's Farm is a very carefully constructed lyric. It takes a lot from the blues tradition, beginning of course with the famous line, "Woke up this morning," which begins a million blues songs. And the way that Dylan uses humour to explain his woes and state his position. In fact, Dylan's control of language in the song is very precise. We begin with one of his famous double negatives, "I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more," similar to "when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose." Such expressions are very much part of American colloquialism, but can also be interpreted as having a dual meaning. You might almost interpret that title line as the protagonist saying, well, he's just going to have to keep on working on Maggie's farm. He's got no choice. And then there's the very clever rhyme scheme that Dylan uses. Wake up this morning, fold my hands and pray for rain. I've got a head full of ideas that are driving me insane. It's a shame the way she makes me scrub the floor. Notice how, having used the conventional A-B pattern, Dylan then adds the extra line at the end of the verse to give us that little ironic twist. This is the bit where we're supposed to feel sorry for the protagonist. We might consider he's just a lazy sod, really, isn't he? Maybe. At the end of the second verse, the pattern is varied a little. We get, he hands you a nickel, he hands you a dime, he asks you with a grin if you're having a good time, then he finds you. So there's a kind of rhyme between time and finds. It's the kind of half rhyme or para rhyme that Dylan's particularly fond of. He also drops the extra rhyming line in later verses. This is a song that's decidedly not going to follow any rules. It's a cry of rebellion, but it's also one in which Dylan very much has his tongue in his cheek. It also conveys a certain joy in rebellion. He's not advocating on any kind of political revolution. He's not pushing any dogma, but what he clearly doesn't want is a life of boredom, which is equated at the end of the song with slavery. Maggie's Farm is a song that's been performed by Dylan literally thousands of times over the years. There are many different versions, some a bit faster, some a bit slower. Very few really match up to that incendiary performance at the Newport Folk Festival. You can't help believing that on that occasion Dylan was really trying to sing these words to his audience. This seems a little bit contradictory because here we have this very liberal audience that supposedly shares his beliefs and values. By going electric in this song, Dylan is declaring his own independence from this particular group of followers. He's also expanding his audience to a very larger population. I'd like to read you a short extract from my book, Determined to Stand, which, as I said, is about late Dylan, but there's an account in the book of a performance of Maggie's Farm in recent years. And I've reflected in this extract on the song's position in American musical history. 11th of February 2011. The tuxedos and the ball gowns have been dusted off yet again for the 53rd Annual Grammy Awards. This is a typically glitzy Hollywood affair at the Staples Center in Los Angeles. Around 26 million viewers have tuned in. In between the gushingly emotional presentations, Norah Jones has led a tribute to Dolly Parton and Mick Jagger has hosted an homage to Solomon Burke. A bunch of female vocalists have bravely attempted to pay some respect to Aretha Franklin. Meanwhile, award winner Eminem has done his thing with his backing tapes, as have Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, Bruno Mars, Justin Bieber and Rihanna, not to mention Gwyneth Paltrow singing along with the Muppets. It's a slickly choreographed show with well-rehearsed curtain changes. In order to fill out the whole glorious evening, there are awards for many musical subcategories, reflecting the diversity of American popular music. There's pop, dance, R&B, rap, country, new age, gospel, Latin, blues, bluegrass, and more. One of the newer categories is Americana, a rather ill-defined combination of some of these strands of music, which had nevertheless become a recognised term by the 1990s. This is represented by Mumford & Sons and the Avett Brothers, both bands of youngish musicians on mandolins, fiddles, guitars and drums, who deliver their contributions with great enthusiasm and energy. They are decked out in authentic 1930s style work clothes, the kind of thing Woody Guthrie would have slipped into when he was off to the Dust Bowl, or in which members of the band would pose for in some sepia-tinted photo shoots back in the day. Just as the Avetts finish their song, they stand up in unison. They are joined not only by the Mumfords, but also a bunch of dodgy-looking gunslingers in dark suits who a few of the audience might recognise as members of Bob Dylan's touring band. They all form a reasonably neat semicircle as if they are about to perform some kind of complicated barn dance. Then they begin to bash hell out of their instruments in a kind of mandolin-led manic hoedown, jumping up and down enthusiastically. Dylan, looking pretty dapper in a black suit and white spats, steps lightly into the middle of this assembly. Unusually for him, he's grinning benignly. Without further ado, he launches straight into, "Well, I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more." Dylan spits out the famously acerbic lyrics with gravelly relish. The whole gang joins in on the chorus, as if they're singing along to a kind of national anthem of Americana, which, in a way, they are. Many years ago, at the Newport Folk Festival on 25th of July 1965, Dylan had launched into his first live appearance with a loud electric band. Maggie's Farm was the standout performance of the three-song set, with Dylan's manic, sneering vocals set against the screaming riffs of Mike Bloomfield, lead guitarist with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. And so a musical revolution began. But there will be no booing or cutting of cables tonight. The performance is a kind of celebration of what Americana has now become, of how it has morphed out of what was once known as folk and now incorporates elements of country, bluegrass, blues and other forms of the people's music, all filtered through a decidedly alternative attitude. Surrounding Bob are a ragged bunch of its most successful modern performers, looking suitably awestruck at backing up the godfather of the genre himself. Dylan stands on the spot where the cameras will catch him, spreading out his arms and swaying. This is a song he has performed many hundreds of times since that historic afternoon, but tonight, possibly because there was only one rehearsal, it has a fresh and original energy. Maggie's Farm is a surreal adrenaline rush of a song with flashes of hilarious lyrical brilliance. I wake up in the morning, fold my hands and pray for rain. It begins, I got a head full of ideas that are driving me insane. This could be a summary of Dylan's astonishingly creative 1965 to 66 period, not to mention a wonderfully funny description of poetic inspiration itself. The song is built on Down on Penny's Farm, a complaint about corrupt landlords recorded by the Bentley Boys in 1929. In a few judiciously chosen lines, Dylan builds up a vivid picture of being imprisoned on a farm on which he is made to slave by various members of the young woman's family, who clearly delight in finding different ways of oppressing him. There is her brother, who finds you every time you slam the door, her pa, whose bedroom window is made out of bricks, and her ma, a scary middle-aged battle-axe who talks to all the servants about man and God and law, and who is 68 but says she's 24. The narrator's free spirit is contained and enslaved by these larger-than-life representations of Middle America. The song is an angry protest against the stifling of the creativity of youth by older generations, a kind of ruthlessly satirical times they are a-changin'. Its merciless satire can be applied to any situation in which mindless bureaucracy or social control is being exercised. It is also Dylan's kiss-off to the fake authenticity of mostly white middle-class folk movement, with its sanctification of American rural workers and its insistence that only acoustic music could be taken seriously. After his incendiary performance at Newport, Dylan would soon have to face down the particularly vocal animosity of some of these folk fans. But his persistence eventually led to the conceptualization of a new musical genre, fueled by the restyling of various elements of traditional American music. It is no exaggeration to say that Americana itself was created during the recording of the legendary basement tapes in the Big Pink House in Woodstock in the summer of 1967. So it is not surprising that Dylan, having originally suffered so much abuse for this vision of American music, is beaming tonight. He is now triumphantly leading a group of devoted acolytes through a delightfully joyous rendition of the song that symbolises their entire musical raison d'etre. The hoedown reaches its exultant climax in the last verse. "Well, I try my best to be just like I am," Dylan twists his head a little and then focuses it on the microphone. "But everybody wants you to be just like them. They say, sing while you slave, I just get bored." After another chorus with everyone joining in, he blows a few notes on his harmonica, bends his knee a little and waves his hand like a conductor to finish the song. He shuffles a little, stares briefly at an unknown point somewhere above him, as if cheekily requesting a little divine blessing, and then he makes a quick exit into the shadows. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that extract. There'll be plenty more episodes of A Headful of Ideas to follow, and you can follow me in various places like Facebook and Twitter. If you just put "From the Pen of Chris Gregory" into the search. If you've got time, try and have a look at my blog, chrisgregory.org, which has lots of other stuff you might enjoy if you've enjoyed this podcast. Just one little final story to relate. Several years ago I was at a Bob Dylan show. I can't exactly remember where it was, but what I do remember that it was policed by security guards who all looked exactly like Phil Mitchell. In other words, squat, bald and ugly. And here on stage was Bob Dylan, the great poet, the modern Shakespeare, the voice of his generation and all that stuff, but they weren't taking any notice at all. What they were doing was making sure that nobody got out of their seats. And at one point you saw a couple of 60-year-old blokes kind of trying to get up and shuffle about a bit and shake their booties to this song that was playing, Maggie's Farm, and I tried to join in. I actually stood up and tried to wave my arms a bit, and after all, this is a rock and roll show. At which point I was told by one of the Phil Mitchell impersonators, in no uncertain terms, to get back into my seat. So in the completely vain hope that the security guy might actually be listening to the music being played and the lyrics of the song, I tried singing the words of Maggie's Farm to him, hoping that he'd understand the ironic significance of this self-deprecatory attack on authority figures. Sadly, this was, of course, in vain, and I had to retreat to my seat, which goes to show, of course, that you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, or something like that. See you again next time.